Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Pulitzer Prize winner, Jeffrey Gettleman. As East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times, Jeffrey Gettleman has covered a dozen countries, including Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Egypt, and Yemen. He has reported on famines, wars, and nightmarish atrocities, yet he has maintained his capacity to care, his desire that others care as well, and the optimism that change is possible as people demonstrate their resilience in attempting to rebuild their communities after these attacks and disasters. Mr. Gettleman does this at considerable risk, having been more than once held prisoner or abducted. He continues to be a foreign correspondent at a time when such individuals clearly constitute an endangered species. Jeffrey Gettleman's work was recognized with the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, which cited, and I quote, his vivid reports, often at personal peril, on famine and conflict in East Africa, a neglected but increasingly strategic part of the world. In addition to his Pulitzer Prize, Jeffrey Gettleman has received numerous other awards, including the Los Angeles Times Editorial Award for Breaking News and the Overseas Press Club Award in 2003 and in 2008. Mr. Gettleman has also served as a commentator on CNN, BBC, PBS, NPR, and ABC. We are so happy to have connected with the Evanston-born and bred Mr. Gettleman on one of his rare trips back to sweet home, Chicago. Tonight, instead of a lecture, we're going to be having a conversation with Mr. Gettleman, and I'm going to start things off with a few questions. And then I will open it up for you all, and we'll be very informal about it. So if we happen to be talking about something, and I ask the question, but something occurs to you connected with that, feel free to just raise your hand, and I'll stop for that. So let's start off this way. When you were a freshman at Evanston Township High School, which happens to be not too far from where I live on Dodge Avenue. Did you ever imagine you would one day be the East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times?
I think I still wanted to be a fireman at that stage. Just let me thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's like a cold, bitter, gray, dark winter night, and it's very nice for everybody to come and listen to us. It's been like a totally crazy life that I'm leading now, and I never, ever had anticipated that growing up. I lived in like a very suburban household. My friends who meet me now are surprised. They say my parents seem very normal and wonder what happened to me. So no, I hadn't traveled much. I didn't know much about Africa. I had no experience really outside the U.S. And journalism was I was never one of these kids that lived and breathed journalism, that worked for their high school newspaper. I really didn't write for my college newspaper. I just wasn't really paying attention to journalism at all. It was only later, when it came time to choose a career, that it seemed like a really good fit for me. But growing up, I played soccer, I played lacrosse. I was a pretty, normal guy. I always liked to write. That was like the one sort of thread throughout my upbringing, and through college, is that I really enjoyed writing. It was something that I was pretty good at, and I just felt comfortable, whether it was writing a philosophy paper or creative writing or a short story or reading really good books. That was always sort of what moved me. And I had a professor at Cornell, where I went to college, who had suggested to me senior year in a creative writing class, hey, why don't you think of working for a newspaper? And I was like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. You know, who wants to work for a boring newspaper? And it took me a few years after I even left college to, you know, to sort of put it all together that I like traveling, I like to write, I liked to experience, you know, new surroundings and to sort of lose the familiarity of my own life and to experience other people's walks of life. And journalism, and I also had this real interest in Africa. I kind of had the where figured out before I had the what. I had been to Africa after my freshman year of college, East Africa, and it just totally blew my mind. I showed up in Nairobi at age 18. I had never experienced anything like that, and just the spirit of people, the openness, the, you know, just polar opposite way of life, people that had so little, but were able to sort of give so much and to show so much emotion, whether it was empathy or laughter or humor or just friendship, like so easily. And I came back from that summer, and I just thought, I have to make this part of my life. And then it took years before I sort of formulated that into being a journalist, and I realized that journalism was a good fit. And then it was like a long odyssey through Central Florida and LA and Atlanta and Iraq and Afghanistan before I finally got back to East Africa about 9 years ago now.
How is reporting in Africa different than maybe reporting in the U.S.? I mean, I'll ask you that, and I have a few follow-up things about that.
I think the basics are the same. I mean, when I decided to be a journalist, it was very clear how you sort of climbed up the ladder and got one of these jobs. That you worked at a small paper, then a medium paper, then a big paper. It was very hierarchical. I resisted that at first. I wanted to I wanted to land at a big paper right out of school, and nobody wanted to hire me. And I remember sending out just stacks of clips and writing samples and just sending these envelopes like all across the United States, and I got nothing, like no bites. And the first job I got was an internship at the Kenosha News. And it was way harder getting that job than it was getting hired at the New York Times or winning a Pulitzer Prize or anything else that I've done. Because nobody knew who I was. I had no experience. It was like, who is this guy, you know? What can he do? And it's like the advice I give to young people is that's the hardest step, is cracking in, is breaking in. Like the rest gets so much easier. But just to like come in as an unknown and have this passion or interest and nobody wants to give you a shot, like that was really frustrating. So I learned how to do journalism, just to not be too long-winded. I learned how to do journalism doing local journalism. My first job was after that internship was at the St. Petersburg Times, and I covered our bar was really, really low for what passed for news. I did a story about a woman who was arrested for raking her lawn because she was topless. And that was like the big news. I did another story about a mom who broke her tooth on a Checkers French fry and sued Checkers for $600,000. And she made this impassioned case about how this had ruined her life. She missed her boys' baseball games, this and that. And the defense attorney for Checkers came in with this big poster of her teeth that were cracked and yellow, and he was saying this was basically an accident waiting to happen. And the jury in this Central Florida town looked at that poster and thought, those teeth look a lot like my teeth. And she won the $600,000. So these were the type of stories that I was doing. And now that I work in Africa for a big paper, the fundamentals are the exact same. You try to, it's not just like, I tell people with journalism, it's not just the facts that are important, it's the feelings, and that to write effectively and powerfully and to get people to respond to what you're covering, you have to tap into that emotion. You have to make the people you're writing about people that generate empathy and people that we care about. People flick through, I've seen people read the newspapers. They just flick through them and it stops, especially online now. The attention span is so short, and so to really grab somebody, you have to give them something that they're going to care about. And I was trying to do that back in Florida, and that's what I keep trying to do now. In Africa, there's so many stereotypes, especially as like a little white Jewish guy running around Africa. You have to be aware of that you know, you can't portray Africa as just this trouble-ridden, conflict, you know, prone, poor, violent place. That's the stereotype of Africa. And at the same time, you don't want to apologize for what happens. You don't want to be in a situation like Darfur or Congo or Somalia and pretend that, okay, this is, you know, this is just how they do it in Africa. It's not how they do it in Africa. You know, people getting slaughtered in Darfur is not acceptable to the people in Darfur. And you can't just like turn that off and be like, okay, well, you know, that's just how they've been doing things. Or the issue of female genital mutilation, like, yes, it's been going on for hundreds of years, but does that make it any better for the people who have to go through it? So with Africa, it's a little trickier because there are these like very, you know, black and white, literally, stereotypes that go back to the Heart of Darkness and the portrayal of Africa, you know, for 100+ years, and the colonialism. I mean, we, from the West, did horrible, brutal things to Africa that still play out today. So that, you have to kind of go into it with some of that in mind. But, you know, journalism, it's I think, like good journalism, even in this internet age, the basics are still just as important. That you want to write with emotion, you want to write things that are going to move people. And in Africa, it's kind of easy because these stories have such, like the suffering is so big and the atrocities are so shocking. In a way, it's like easier to tap into that because the stuff is happening and you show up and like half the work or 3/4 of the work is just getting to these places. Because I'll sometimes cover a story in a corner of Congo, like I did this big ivory series a few years ago. Elephants are getting slaughtered at record rates right now because people in China have more money than they ever have had in history, and they want ivory. And the ivory comes from the poorest, most messed up, corrupt, fragile states in the world, these countries in Central and Eastern Africa. And the Chinese are driving this demand to slaughter elephants, and they're getting slaughtered by the tens of thousands. And I did this story a couple years ago, and we had to go to like the farthest places in Congo or Gabon, South Sudan, that like where the last herds of elephants are really, really far out there. And these trips are like dangerous and long and expensive and uncomfortable, and there's malaria and rebel groups and snakes and all kinds of stuff. And that's like one of the biggest challenges I face is just trying to get to a place like that. Once I'm there, my training and experience and instincts just sort of kick in. I know what to do. I know how to interview people. I know sort of what I'm going after. And I think Africa today presents like still logistical and on-the-ground challenges that no other part of the world has.
Do you care to share with us your experience in being abducted and held for a while?
I mean,
I know that...
no, of course. I'm happy to tell that story.
Okay. It might be a difficult story to revisit, but...
No, it's fine.
I'm not sure your parents want to hear it, but...
They've heard it before. They'll survive. So I was a reporter in Iraq in 2004, and it was at a time when everything was in flux. There was a period when Iraq was somewhat safe to operate in as an outsider, as a journalist, and then there was a period where it was like total hell, nobody moved, it was like the most dangerous place in the world. In 2004, when I was there, it was right in between, so it was kind of hard to read what was happening. And I was in our bureau in Baghdad, and a call went out that there had just been a big bombing near Fallujah. So I was like the youngest guy in the bureau. The boss was actually sleeping at the time. And I thought, okay, it was kind of up to me to make the decision. And my boss is in New York. We're 9 hours ahead, so this was in the morning. There was no way to consult and be like, ask, hey, is it safe to go and cover this, and what should we do, and how should we do it? You know, I was 32 years old and was making the decision myself. So I said, hey, let's do it, you know. We've been told this area is relatively safe. Let's go. So I piled into a car with with a photographer, translator, driver, and we had another car behind us with our guards, some Iraqi guys with guns that would sort of shadow us. And we went flying down this road out into the desert, into the Sunni Triangle, which then later became like the heart of the resistance. And we drove for like a half an hour outside of Baghdad, and the city sort of drops off. The landscape becomes very flat, very gravelly. You see a few little sort of squarish mud huts and some palm trees here and there, but it's pretty desolate. And we were following this road through this sort of desolate, barren countryside, and we took a turn in the road, and all of a sudden this van sped in front of us and cut off the road, and within like a second, the doors flew open, and these guys with masks and machine guns came pouring out into the road, and at the same exact time, dozens of men who had been hiding in the dirt just popped up, like materialized out of the desert air and surrounded us. And within seconds, we were stopped, we were off the road, and we had 60 guys with guns pointing at us.
Oh.
And somebody started pounding on the window that I was sitting in, pointing at me and saying, in a mix of Arabic and English, "Yella, out, out, out." And the woman next to me, the photographer, is like, "Don't get out, don't get out. They're going to kill you if you get out. Don't get out." And we were in a car that was bulletproof, but it wasn't that bulletproof. So I had to get out of the car, and I stepped out, and this guy sort of pushed me away from everybody and raised his gun and chambered a bullet and lined it up with me. And I thought at that moment, like, this all happened so fast. And I was totally powerless. And I thought at that moment, that was it. Like, I just thought, that my last thought was, I hope it doesn't hurt. Like, this is it.
Oh.
So then, obviously, he didn't shoot. And they pushed us into a car. And as we were speeding off to their little base, I had an American passport. For some dumb reason, I was carrying my American passport. But it was tricky at this time because sometimes we had to go through these American military checkpoints, and they were very like jittery too. And at one point we came up to a checkpoint, and these Marines, pulled up their guns and were like ready to shoot us because they didn't know who we were. So it was constant like stress of how to handle the situation. So I had the American passport in my hand, and when these gunmen weren't looking, I handed it to the female photographer next to me, who was also American. And she put it down her jeans and hid it. And then when the guys started interrogating us, they were really insistent on finding out whether we were American and who we were and what we were doing. And we were journalists, so we told them we're journalists. And they said, well, where are you from? Where are you from? You look American. And I was just trying to think of like something that would save my ass at that moment. So I said, I'm Greek. And
I think there are a couple of Greek friends in the audience.
Thank God for the Greek friends. And that kind of stumped these guys. And I thought of Greece because most of the Western countries in Iraq at the time, most of the Western countries in the world were with the U.S. in this, kind of bungled operation in Iraq. So, England, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Poland. There was just a whole big coalition. So I couldn't name, there have been other times in my life where I had concealed the fact I was American and said I was Canadian or Australian or whatever. I couldn't do any of that. Greece was one of the few countries that wasn't there, and they had a really good soccer team. And Iraqis love soccer. So they bought that for a while, and they interrogated us for hours, and I kept up this lie, and I was really lucky that these guys weren't sophisticated enough or had high-speed internet access to say, who's the president of Greece? Or draw me a map of Greece? Or, say, give me some water in Greek or something. They didn't do that. And so we spent the whole day, like, getting interrogated at gunpoint, and I was keeping this lie going, and it was exhausting. And I really, I knew if they found out I was American, if they found that passport on her, or if they could discern I was American, they would kill us. Like, that was clear. And then at the end of the night, finally, a sort of leader of the group came. And I think a lot of these guys, this was right outside Fallujah. This is like prime ISIS territory now. Like the same guys that took us were part of the Sunni resistance that never really liked the whole idea of this new Iraq and were Saddam Hussein's, cohorts, and then later broke off and formed this Al-Qaeda in Iraq and now ISIS. And these guys, we were getting into more senior guys as the day wore on, and finally some guy came into our room, and he's like, okay, for the last time, tell me, who are you, where are you from, this and that. And I was so tired and just stressed. And I was like, were Greek, and it was getting to be nightfall. It was like 6 p.m., and I thought, if these guys keep us here for the night, we're screwed, because then they're going to pass us up to somebody more sophisticated, and they're going to quickly get to the bottom. They'll search our car, they'll find something. And at the end of the night, the guy looked at us, and he's like, okay, you guys can go. And they let us out, and it was the funniest thing was right before we got into the car to drive off, some other insurgent, like with the mask on, a big gun, came up to us, and he said, be careful, guys, it's dangerous out there.
Oh.
And then we drove home, we drove back to Baghdad, and when we got to the bureau, the whole staff was waiting for us on the lawn, and everybody hugged us and just started bawling. And it was at that moment that I realized they had basically counted us as dead. And it was like we had come back to life.
Unbelievable. Did you get any training
No.
for going into that kind of situation?
Except what my parents gave me growing
But
up.
it just seems to me, especially now, I don't know if it's changed now, but things have gotten, if anything, more dangerous. And so it seems as if a foreign correspondent should have some training in what to do in a situation like that.
I totally agree. We did some training that was like this kind of bullshit, like first aid, combat environment training. But it's not like that. Like, you're not running around a battlefield ducking mortars. I mean, there was a time when I was embedded, and there was a few instances of being on like a battlefield, but that was rare. No, I think it's like a lot you really need. You need to do some role playing. You need to do some kind of like situational, some like games or mock, some exercises. And a lot of it is about emotional intelligence. And like, I was lying, and I'm not like especially a good liar or comfortable lying. And like, that was really hard to like look these guys in the face and like just lie to save my skin. And maybe there's a way to practice for that. But, I think it's just getting, like, the world is getting smaller for journalists. If you look at like a map of Africa where I work, and you look at what journalists were able to do 30 or 40 years ago, they could go anywhere. They weren't part of the equation. Nobody was kidnapping or beheading journalists. There were civil wars, and there were guys fighting, and rebel groups, and there was a superpower war in a lot of these African countries, in Angola and Mozambique, Congo even. But the journalists weren't part of the equation. Nobody was out to like slaughter, Western civilians. And that's how it is now. So there's a huge band, and this is like the scary thing with ISIS. Like, if these guys get ambitious, they're going to figure this out, and maybe they already are. I mean, there's a huge band from basically the west coast of Africa, from Nigeria, that goes across the Sahara, through Central Africa, through Sudan, all the way out, up to the Middle East now. That's almost contiguous, of territory that is full of Islamic radicals that hate Westerners and want to fight this holy war. And we can't go there. I mean, I know I have friends that, I knew guys that were killed in Libya. I know other people that were taken hostage in different places. In Syria, people have, been killed. I mean, it's getting more dangerous. So yeah, I don't think anybody's really like figured out how to plan for that and deal with that. And these stories are big. This is like what everybody in the room's interested in, like ISIS, the beheadings, and Iraq and Libya. Everybody wants like more information about these places. So that's the pressure. It's like, you got to go in there and get the story. And it's not like my bosses are like, hey, we don't care what happens to you, just get me the story. That doesn't really happen. But we put the pressure on ourselves. Like, we want to get the story. Like, when I was in Iraq, I wanted to be on that road. Well, nobody forced me. I wanted to be there and get this fresh account of a big thing that just happened, and try to write it as well as I could and send it out there. And it's the same with Africa. And it's even more of a mystery now, like who these guys are in ISIS and what are their plans. And I mean, this is like the biggest challenge that we've seen. I mean, not in the sense of like a superpower or a direct threat to the United States, but a kind of ideological battle. Like, this is a really new thing, and we don't really understand who these guys are or what their goals are. Like, do they really think it's realistic that they're going to establish an Islamic caliphate, and while the whole world is like against them? and they're attracting Westerners, and they're encouraging these copycat crimes with very little like aid, direct aid. And is Al-Qaeda a group or is it a philosophy? Like this is what we're all dealing with now. So the journalists are like the guys trying to get to figure this out, and it's dangerous. I never got into this profession because of the dangers, the thrills. And I work with some people that are totally insane, that will run right to the gunfire, have no qualms about going anywhere. And I've never really, that hasn't been my thing. I got into journalism because I wanted to work in Africa. I wanted to tell feature stories. I wanted to sort of get out into the wild, into these wide open spaces where people live a totally different life, and try to tell some of those stories. But the big stories that people want are these conflict stories. It's very hard to be taken. I mean, that's why I won the Pulitzer Prize. I didn't win it for some light feature stories, about some kids doing good things in a Kenyan slum. I won it for a famine or in a civil war in Sudan. So that's like unfortunately, sort of the dark side of our business, is that people want this news about conflict, and there's a lot of opportunities. Like I tell people, it's very easy to get killed out there.
In terms of the Pulitzer Prize and the stories that you wrote that earned you the Pulitzer Prize, is there a moment, I know you did a lot of writing about Sudan, you did a lot of writing about the famine, but is there some particular story or individual that stands out, or scene that stands out for you?
No, it wasn't, what was so nice about winning it, it's like you shouldn't get wrapped up in the external validation. You shouldn't be doing none of us should be doing our work to win prizes, to win awards. But it's nice to win a big award. So I had been working, my story was I'd been working in Somalia. I'd been there like more than anybody else, any other journalist, for years before winning the Pulitzer. I had been doing stories about the rise of this Islamic group, the Shabab, that now is like we all know about because they've done all these nasty things. I had covered the pirates. Like nobody talks about the pirates anymore. But I used to cover these guys all the time. And I went into Somalia and even met with some of these big pirate kings. And it was like the craziest thing. I went to this town, and one of the most notorious wanted pirates in the world was just hanging out at this restaurant, totally in the open. The police were coming up to him, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. The mayor gave him a big hug. He was like, the president of the place. And I was having lunch with this guy, and he thought it was the funniest thing to be like hanging out with some white, journalist, because these are usually the type of people he kidnaps. And he's like, oh, this is funny. It's like the cat eating, lunch with the mice. And I was like, great, man. Let's just get out of this lunch fast. So I had been doing all this work on Somalia for years. So when the famine happened, I had like a network there. I had sources there. I knew the country pretty well. I had been to all these obscure places to do all these different stories over the years. And then all of a sudden there was this big story that had kind of been rolling through the region for a couple of years. Famines don't just like happen like that. It's a result of an accumulation of bad weather that produces a drought, and then political causes. Every famine, even like the one in 1984-85 in Ethiopia, had a political cause to it, that the Ethiopian government was blocking food into a region, and all these people started starving. So you need both, because Kenya, for instance, has droughts all the time, and poor people starve, and some people die, but there's ways to get them food. And before it gets too bad, the relief is brought to them. And there's a huge worldwide industry that moves, billions of dollars of food around the world on these big ships, and the American farmers, they get it from the American farmers, and they subsidize it, and the U.S. government buys it, and it ships it, and it goes to these places like Kenya, Mombasa, Kenya, and then it gets put on trucks. It's a whole huge industry. So that's how most droughts and humanitarian emergencies are handled. But in Somalia, the Shabab was blocking the food aid because they didn't like the Westerners. They didn't like anything Western, and they were like, we're not going to let any food aid in, and then there was a drought, and all these people needed food. So interestingly about the Pulitzer is I nominated myself for a Pulitzer, which at the time was considered very unorthodox. And some people thought it was arrogant, some people thought it was presumptuous, and it wasn't. It was that there was a pecking order at the New York Times of who gets to be nominated for a Pulitzer, but there was also the openness. If you think you can win, go for it. But then you have to, it's actually like a laborious process. You have to take all your stories and lay them out a certain way, and it's not easy there's like a high sort of barrier to entry just to submit yourself, because they have to be formatted very particularly, and the rules are very anal and specific. And so I had a friend helping me, like, she was in San Francisco and laying them out for me, a friend from high school, and we submitted them. And everybody thought, this was 2011, everybody thought that the Arab Spring was the big foreign story. And it was. Like, it was a much bigger event in the world. Egypt had, totally gone through this revolution. Tunisia, Libya, Syria, all of this was kicking off. But often in the history of the Pulitzer, the big story doesn't win because there's a lot of journalists that are doing the same thing. So the New York Times covered the Arab Spring really thoroughly. The Washington Post covered the Arab Spring really thoroughly. Wall Street Journal covered the Arab Spring really thoroughly. So I kind of had a feeling like nobody was really covering Somalia, and I had all this experience, and I had this access that few other journalists had, and I did stories on the pirates, on the famine, on the clans. I did a bunch of stuff. It wasn't just on the famine. So I put this stuff forward, and nobody really thought much of it. And then I got a call from my editors, like, the week that the announcement was going to be made, and I got this panic call from this guy at the New York Times. He's like, did you nominate yourself? What's going on? You're a finalist. I was like, that's great. I was like, yeah, I did nominate myself, and actually other people at the paper who sit right next to you knew, and if you guys actually talked, you would have known that. So then I told my parents, it was like, they make the decision on a Friday. That's when they make the decision, and they announce it on a Monday. And the reason why I'm going on is this is like a Pulitzer series, so, I might as well.
Oh, we
Okay.
love to hear about it, right?
This is like a long story.
This is wonderful.
Then you don't have to ask the next guy about it. It was a Friday, it was like a Thursday, and I called my parents. I was like, guys, I'm a finalist. And my parents were like, should we come in? What should we do? And I was like, I don't know. And my dad's like, well, I got to make my plans. Are you going to win or not? And I was like, Dad, it's like 1 out of 3. Like, you got to make the decision. Like, there's 3 finalists, I'm one of them. So then it's like this really tense moment. So then the Friday comes. And the way the Pulitzer works is there's 2 stages. There's a jury of your peers for every category. There's like 12 categories for the Pulitzer. There's a bunch for news. There's like spot news, local news, foreign news, investigative news. Then there's political cartoons. Then there's some literary categories for fiction, nonfiction, biography. Each of those categories has a jury of peers. So for me as a journalist, there's a bunch of foreign correspondents or former foreign correspondents that go through like all the dozens of entries, and they pick 3 and they forward it to the board. The board then meets on a Friday and makes a decision for all the categories. And we knew exactly when they were meeting, and the New York Times had it kind of wired and was waiting, and they said, you're going to get a call by 5 p.m. on Friday to find out if you won.
Does the board also consist of former Pulitzer Prize winners?
The board is like a mix. Like, there's people in the humanities, there's writers, there's a bunch of journalists, but it's not all journalists. There's like a woman on the board now, the chairman, who is like a philosopher at Princeton. No journalism experience. So they try to mix it up a little bit. So I was sitting there, my wife and I were feeding our kids, and that's like the hardest thing I do in my life. Like, way harder than Iraqi insurgents, trying to get our kids to eat. So we're sitting in her house in upstate New York, and we're feeding the kids. We're just sitting there, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and I see the caller ID of the New York Times, and I think, this is it. Like, this is either going to change my life or not. And I answer the phone, I say hello, and I'm really nervous. And the instant I say hello, I hear the editor-in-chief's voice say, hello, Jeffrey. There's a woman at the time, Jill Abramson. And the instant I heard her voice, I just started crying because I knew that she wouldn't be calling me to tell me that. Somebody else would have called me if I lost. So they don't waste
Somebody lower down.
Yeah, they don't waste the time with the losers. So yeah, it was a really great feeling. And again, like, you don't want to get too wrapped up in this stuff, but I just felt like I had done a lot of good work over the years. It wasn't just for those 10. Your submission is 10 specific stories, and it wasn't just those 10 stories. It was the fact I'd been there and risked my life and had done stories about a place that people didn't really care about, they'd sort of forgotten about. Somalia was like a huge story in the 90s with Black Hawk Down, and then everybody forgot about it. And that was one reason why it got all screwed up, because these forces festered there, and it came back to bite us in the butt. And then, directly with the terrorism and then with the famine, all this was like things that we created by our neglect. So I just felt good that like I had done my, good work for that place that hadn't really gotten much of a voice and hadn't gotten much attention. And yeah, it was a great feeling.
And did it have much of an impact? I mean, it's a fairly recent event. It's only a couple of years ago, right?
Well, we got to meet. Yeah, it didn't. I mean, I was lucky. If I had been younger, I'm 43. If I had been younger and like at a small paper, it would have like totally changed my career, because I would have been discovered and gotten some opportunities. I already had a job that was like my dream job. I was already working for the New York Times. I'm in the region that I've always wanted to work in. So it didn't make a huge difference in that regard, but another thing that I wanted to do was write a book, and now I'm now working on a book, and it was easier to get a contract for a book.
Once you won the
Yeah,
Pulitzer.
it was just like the reality. I mean, so that was like a great benefit of it.
Jack Schaefer in Slate magazine and Eric Leake in the British publication Writing on the Edge referred to the Gettleman method, and this is how they describe it. Direct, easy on the cynicism, and without a hint of any world weariness. If that is a fair description, how on earth do you avoid world weariness or even downright despair when covering conflicts that involve the slaughter of humans, rape and pillaging of entire villages, forced enlistment of children, to say nothing of the decimation of an entire species of animals? So how...
If it's unfair, do I not have to answer?
How do you hold on to that Gettleman method?
It's hard. I mean, I do get numb sometimes. It takes like more to move me. I was just covering Ebola a couple months ago, and don't worry, I've been through the quarantine. And it was like, at first I didn't really want to, I wasn't like hungry to do that. My bosses had asked me to cover it when it started to be a hot story in like June, July, August, and I had no interest in going to jump into the Ebola story. I didn't want to get Ebola. I was worried about my family. I was worried about my kids. It's like I don't feel that sort of hunger that I used to feel, like where I would run in and do the interviews with the pirates or go down the road to Fallujah. I was just like, you know what, I just don't need that. And then they sort of put a little more pressure on me, and then I sort of thought, okay, this is like a big Africa story. It's important. I'm working on a book about Africa. Like, I should experience it and try to do my best, like, telling that story. So I went there, and, pretty early, like my first full day in Sierra Leone, we showed up at a house, and there was a girl who was really sick. And she clearly had Ebola, and I was just really surprised. I was like, what's going on? She's sick. Why doesn't somebody take her to the hospital? Why don't we take her to the hospital? And the guys I was with were like, we can't do that. And I was like, why not? They're like, well, our car isn't configured right. We don't have the right suits. Like, we just got to leave her here and hope somebody helps her. And I was like, well, that's crazy. Like, she's obviously going to die if nobody helps her. So the next day we went back, and her neighbors there was like a hotline in Sierra Leone. All this aid had been flowing into these places, like an enormous amount of resources, helicopters and experts and ambulances and electronics and cell phone towers and all this to speed up the whole Ebola treatment chain. Somebody gets sick, you identify them, you move them to a treatment center, you take their blood. If they have Ebola, they go to another center. If they don't, they get out. This whole sort of, system to treat people and contain the disease. And a lot of this was selfish. Like, these Western countries were going in there because they didn't want Ebola to spread. Right. So it's like, let's stop it in Sierra Leone. Let's stop it in Liberia. Let's not let it get all the way over to us. So the second day I see this girl, and she's even worse. She's now like on her back, totally sweaty, kind of delirious. And I'm just sort of looking. I didn't go in the house. I was tempted. Like, I kind of wanted to like see her house and see how she was living. And then I thought, that's like crazy, to get that close. So I didn't. But the photographer like suited up, took pictures of her, and the family kept calling this hotline. And the treatment center was 20 minutes down the road, 20 minutes away. So then I called up the hotline. I'm like, hey, you know, I'm an observer. I'm watching this girl. She's really sick. She needs an ambulance. Get somebody out here. And the guy's like, how do you spell your name again? And I'm like, it's not about, you know, me. Like, they were just fixated on these details. And I was like, no, you just, here's her address. Here's how, you know, what she needs. She's going to die. And then the third day, we went back there, and she was dead. And it just, like, it was infuriating and really depressing. And it actually made me, I was, like, really messed up by that. I, like, called my wife. I was crying. I was just like, what? And then I later learned that many people who have Ebola can survive with very simple medicine, like very simple medicine. Rehydration salts that helps them absorb fluids so they don't dehydrate and die. Antibiotics that will help keep off any opportunistic infections. An IV. And I felt really guilty that I hadn't, like, rushed out to a drugstore, because there are drugstores that sell all this stuff, bought all this stuff and brought it back to her house. Like, I didn't move heaven and earth to, like, help her. I tried to call. I called somebody else that I knew that was working for the UN. I was like, hey, you guys got to help this girl. I did, like, more than a lot of people had done in that similar situation, but I was, like, really angry at myself.
But weren't you prevented from or discouraged from doing that kind of thing?
I was discouraged from putting her in our car, but I wasn't. But later, I told an editor that I work with who I like, and he's like, okay, well, here's what you have to do. You have to just buy all that stuff, keep it in your car, and if you meet somebody like her, like, be ready to dispense the aid, because nobody else is doing it. And so we did that. But we drove around for the next 2 weeks in Sierra Leone and never saw anybody like that. We either saw people that were okay, or we saw people that were dying and it was too late. But we never saw somebody in that limbo. And it just, again, like, it's hard. I mean, these are deeper questions about what's the role of a journalist and being an observer and how much should you get involved. And Ebola was a tricky one because, like, in the famine in Somalia or some other stuff I covered, I can help people. Like, I can help them. I can give them money if they need money. I can give them a ride. Like, I can help, you know, tell other people about their needs. But with Ebola, I couldn't, I was, like, shackled. I couldn't, you know, pick her up and put her in our car and drive her to, we had a good car. It was full of fuel. The place was 20 minutes away. And there was just, the whole system, like, broke down. So I wrote about that. We did a big front page story about that. I then wrote a weekend review piece, like our analysis section on Sunday, about this whole, everything I just told you about, how I felt really guilty and helpless, and how the system just kind of sucks. And, you know, a lot of people were blaming the Africans, saying they're not changing their behavior, they're still following these superstitions, you know, they're doing these unsafe burial practices. I mean, you guys have heard all this stuff about how Ebola spreads. But that's why this case was, like, so infuriating to me. It's like this family had done the exact right thing. They had kept the girl in the house. They didn't hide her. Some families were hiding people with Ebola because they were worried about putting them in a hospital. They didn't hide her. They called the hotline. They kept everybody away. They did everything by the book. And so you talk about, just to answer the question, like, directly and succinctly, you know, I do get some weariness at times, but not so much that there aren't things that still, like, really move me.
That says a lot about you, though, because others in your situation probably would get worn down, and I'm sure you've seen that happen, have you not, with some other journalists who are covering these kinds of situations and develop kind of such a tough skin that they're not moved by it.
I think if you get to that point, your writing or your photos or whatever angle of journalism you're doing is just not going to be as good. I think you can't move anybody unless you yourself are moved. And you have to feel that and then try to transmit that.
I have a few more questions of my own, but I want to open things up so this wonderful audience that we have here can ask some questions that they have. Anybody out there would like to ask Jeffrey a question?
I've been so impressed the way people in foreign countries speak English, a lot better than a lot of us. And how do you communicate with all these different people, like the Somalians? Did they speak English, or did you have a translator?
So in East Africa, most people speak, a lot of people speak Swahili. And I actually studied Swahili in college. And my Swahili is like pretty good. I can fool people that I'm fluent. I'm not. But if you heard me, you'd be like, oh yeah, that guy's fluent in Swahili, but he's not really. But I'm good enough where I can do interviews and I can ask what I want and I can take, I can understand most of what comes back at me. That's for certain countries in East Africa, but as you go farther away from Kenya, there are different languages. So in Somalia, I have a translator. In Iraq, we had translators. I spoke a little Arabic because Swahili actually has a lot of Arabic in it. Swahili was a language that was formed when the Arabs came to begin trading with the Africans like 1,000 years ago or even more. And they formed this trade language that's a mix of Arabic and local African languages. So there's a lot of Arabic in Swahili. So I speak like a little Arabic, I can understand some stuff. But it's much better when you speak the language. And to your point about English, like Kenyans speak really good English. It's very hard to find Kenyans that don't speak English, especially in the cities. But it's so much better when you don't have a translator because like so much of journalism, like anything else, it's establishing a rapport. It's like trying to sort of connect with somebody and do that really fast. And you have an agenda, trying to get the information, but you still want to have a connection to the person. You want them to like trust you and feel okay sharing something personal. And if you can communicate with them, even if it's not perfect. So my Swahili isn't like perfect, but they see that I'm trying, and I think that goes a long way. And you also learn. It's like you're using your brain more. It's like you're studying as you're doing your work because you're trying to speak a foreign language, and I'm writing down words that I hadn't heard before. So it's like it's cool. It's like you're in class while you're doing your job.
Regarding Somalia, do you see some positive trends in Somalia?
Yeah, I mean, it's better than it was. That's a good question. I mean, Somalia had been in such a rut since 1991. Somalia was an Italian colony, very poor place, mostly nomadic. They didn't even have a written language until 1971. They spoke like everything was oral until 1971. They had no written language. Very poor place, and was totally at the whim of the superpowers. It was a Soviet ally for many years. And then Ethiopia, which is its rival, became a Soviet ally. And Ethiopia had been an American ally, and the two superpowers just switched, and the U.S. started supporting Somalia, Soviets started supporting Ethiopia, and they just poured tons of arms into those two countries as to check the dominance of the other one. And the result was these countries were really poorly run, corrupt, despotic places with tons of uneducated people and tons of high-powered weaponry. And as soon as the Cold War ended in 1990, the Horn of Africa blew up. And Ethiopia blew up, Somalia blew up, Congo a few years later blew up, Rwanda happened. It was all like connected in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia. There was a lot of engagement by the U.S. and the Western powers and by the Soviet Union in these poor African countries just because they were worried about the influence of the other. And the minute that the Soviet Union disappeared, the U.S. didn't care anymore, and the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. And so a place like Somalia it just turned into anarchy. And it had been like that from basically 1991 to 2006. Then this Islamic group came and said, okay, everybody's been fighting clan by clan. Somalia is really interesting, actually. It's one of the most homogenous countries in the world. Everybody speaks the same language, Somali, same religion, Sunni Muslim, same culture, same ethnicity, same race. There's like very few countries in the world besides like some obscure Pacific islands that you could say that about. Yet it then is divided among clans. So everybody speaks the same language, same religion, everything, but they have different genealogies. These guys started fighting in the 90s, and it had been like that till 2006 till I showed up. And I showed up in East Africa at this really interesting time when Somalia, after all these years, was just beginning to turn because this Islamic group said, okay, let's unify everybody with Islam. And they made some progress, and they actually brought peace to Somalia for the first time. Well, the United States didn't like that. And the Bush administration didn't like that. And so then they teamed up with Ethiopia and they threw these guys out, and that created a whole new wave of chaos, and then that led to the famine. And so since then, things have gotten a little better. Like after the famine, the Islamic group has been kind of pushed out, or the moderates have been incorporated to the government. But I don't see, I see a lot of these countries like Somalia, Congo, South Sudan, I think they're going to be pretty messed up for decades. I think the world we live in now, it's all about resources. It's about a scramble. It's like the new scramble for Africa with China and the West and these other countries trying to get, the oil, the minerals, the gold, the timber, the water, the whatever, energy out of these places. And you don't really need a government for that. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these commercial interests going into these places without a real effort to set up a government. And Somalia is an example. So it'll be more peaceful, but I don't think it'll be like a functioning, centrally controlled place for a long, long time, if ever.
I think there was a gentleman over here.
Thank you. You asked such excellent questions. You've taken each and every one of the questions I had wanted to ask. But as a high school classmate of Jeff, I think we all knew that you would be super successful. We could never have imagined your life trajectory, but it's such a source of alumni and school and civic pride for Evanstonians. Among your many, many distinctions, one of your early ones was that you were a Marshall Scholar. I remember seeing in a tweet you indicated that your study of anthropology was pivotal, that you thought that was just an invaluable part of your reporting. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how studying anthropology as a Marshall Scholar has influenced your reporting.
That's a really good question. I can't believe you even saw that tweet. I think for journalism, you can basically study anything. I wasn't that focused as a student. As an undergraduate, I was all over the place. At Cornell, I took philosophy. I was a philosophy major because it was the easiest major to satisfy. You take 8 philosophy classes, they leave you alone. But then I took Swahili, I took Indonesian, I took sculpture, I took photography, I took creative writing. I was all over the place. I took biology for pre-med, I took economics. So, that in a way was really good for what I'm doing now, to have that breadth. But at the time I was just trying to find something. I was just trying to look for something that fit me. Then when I got to graduate school, I had to get a little more serious. I had to pretend I had an academic focus. I really didn't. But anthropology was good. One, a lot of it was set in Africa. Unbelievably, the region that I was really interested in was where the field, a lot of the field was sort of perfected in a kind of weird colonial way. But the British, colonized East Africa, and British anthropologists were the ones doing these groundbreaking works in the 20s and 30s on the Nuer of South Sudan, who are now in this civil war, and the Dinka and the Azande of Congo. All these places I now live and work. That was the root of modern anthropology. They sent these guys out to spend a few years living in one of these cultures, and they would teach themselves the language and write these really boring, dry books about every little thing that these people did. So that was cool that I remember, it's so funny, I found some notes from my anthropology lectures in 1996 about Darfur. And I didn't even remember that I had studied Darfur. So yeah, it shows you how useful that was. But then the process of anthropology is similar in a way to journalism in that you're trying to bridge a gap. You're trying to understand a different culture. You're trying to connect with somebody, get information from them, and then present it in a meaningful way, find some meaning. And these guys spent years doing it, and they did it very thoroughly, whereas a journalist does it very superficially. But that idea of kind of being curious and observant. And then the idea also of these anthropologists, they were like these geeky, old white guys that would just hang back in the village and just write everything down. And that's sometimes what we do. You see all these crazy things happening in front of you, and you just got to kind of withdraw a little bit. One, to protect yourself, and two, just to keep your focus and take the notes and figure out what's going on and use that material. I mean, so many times I just take in all this material and I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I remember I was in Hinesville, Georgia in 2003 in January, as it was clear the United States was about to go to war in Iraq, and they were calling up troops. And in Georgia, that's like, there's big military bases across the South, and that's where all these guys are going to Iraq from. And I was assigned to like do a story about the preparation for the war in Iraq. And I went to this town, and I went to this Army surplus store that was just, it was like the Black Friday sales. You know, there were parents, there were soldiers, everybody was just clearing off the taking everything off the shelves, just gobbling everything up. And I went to the back, and these women were sewing up acres of fatigues, stitching the names of all the soldiers who were going off to war, just piles and piles and piles of fatigues that were being customized. And I just started writing down the names of all the little labels of the soldiers. These were like real men, real kids, about to go off to war. And I just started writing down all the names. Like, there was hundreds of them. And I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but let me just write down all the names. And I did that, and this just gets back, like an anthropologist would do something like that. And I got back to my office or the hotel where I was working, and I used those names. So I did something that was like a little unusual for the New York Times to even go for this, and I was surprised that they didn't cut it out. But I just started the story with a bunch of names. And I actually had so many names I could put them in alphabetical order. So it was like Abraham, Baca, Cortland, Demirio. And then I started writing the story. And then the next like 5 paragraphs down, I had, Frank and Gettleman, Goldman, whatever. And then it went all the way down. The last line of the story was like Zachario. I had a Z name. And so it was
Humanized.
But I was like
story.
desperate for material, and I just wanted, I didn't know I was like under pressure, and I was like, let me just do something with these names.
Okay, good. Okay,
As I was reading about you, you won an overseas award in 2003 about an article, Pakistani boys keeping it. How you felt about this?
That was like one of the more gratifying things I've done as a journalist, actually. So it's kind of a long story, but I was sent to Afghanistan in 2002. And that was like the best time to be in Afghanistan for the last like 20 or 30 years, because Taliban had been in control up until 2001. Then September 11th happened. The U.S. went in there. They drove these guys out, and there was a little window in 2002 when it was peaceful. There was hope. There was no Taliban, and like the fighting had stopped for the first time in, I don't know, since like even before the Soviets came in, because the Soviets came in '79, because there was already like a civil war. So for the first time, Afghanistan was peaceful. And little girls were going to school for the first time because the Taliban had, killed female education. People were, clearing out minefields, and it's a beautiful country. It's like one of the most spectacular, visually spectacular countries I've ever seen. Just, pure blue skies, sharp white mountains, beautiful green fields, little stone houses, old-fashioned like water wheels from like a Grimm's fairy tale, running down a mountain stream. I mean, amazing. So I was doing all these stories, and I was looking for there had been some big battles, and I was looking for Taliban, because I'd been told there was this big battle, and all these Taliban had been captured. So I was writing about the battle, and it's like, okay, I got the one side of the story from the Northern Alliance guys that fought with the U.S. Let me get the other side, the Taliban side. And I couldn't find any of these guys. And I started to get a little suspicious, because there had been I found some lists that these warlords kept of like names of like dozens of names that they'd written down of prisoners, and they were nowhere to be found. And I was like, that's just weird. Like, there's always prisoners taken in battles. So then finally, this like young warlord, this guy was like 23 years old, had like thousands of men under his command because his dad had been a warlord. It's like, dude, I know where a prisoner is. I was like, okay, let's go check it out. So he takes me to this dingy little house, and there's this 16-year-old boy, Pakistani boy, being kept in like a dungeon. And we're like, this is weird. Like, there's a Red Cross-run prison. There's the Americans here. Like, why is this kid kind of like outside the system being kept? And we got some information from him, and the warlords holding him, these were American allies, by the way. Everybody's an American ally. These are American allies that the U.S. had armed and trained that were holding this boy. And I was like, that's weird. Like, this guy shouldn't be here. So I went back, and then I started questioning the Americans. I'm like, hey, like, what's going on? You guys know what happened to these Taliban prisoners? Why is this boy there? And they're like, oh, it's not our problem. Like, we don't know. So then I went back to the boy, and because the first time I met him, I was like kind of nervous. The whole scene was really tense. These guys with guns were behind me. They didn't like me talking to him. It was just an awkward situation. So the second time I went back to him, I was like, okay, they're gonna like yank me out of here any minute. Tell me I had his name, but I was like, tell me your father's name, tell me where you live, tell me how to get in touch with your family. So he tells me really quickly, like his father works at a mosque in Lahore, Pakistan, here's the name of the street. That was it. And then they hustle me out of there. And later, like the next day, the people I'm working with say, we think he's being abused, that they're raping him, and they're torturing him. And he had all these cuts on his arms, and he was just crying like the whole time I was trying to talk to him. So I was like, wow, okay, what do I do? And my editors were like, hey, let's get this story in about this battle, you know, and I was like, no, just let me like follow this through, like there's something here. So I convinced them to let me go to Pakistan, and I tracked down the kid's family, and they thought he was dead. They hadn't heard anything from this kid for like 6 months. And he went off to fight the Americans, joined the Taliban, and that they just assumed he had been martyred. And I showed him this picture on my digital camera. I'm like, and I was pretty like cool and level-headed about this. I just didn't tell the dad who I was. We like found the dad, somebody introduced me to him. They just said, this Western guy wants to talk to you. And I said, do you know this guy? And the dad just started crying. And they just hugged me. He hugged the camera. He's like, that's my son. Like, where is he? And it ends up that the son was basically being held for ransom. And these American-backed warlords were holding this kid and abusing him and raping him until the family could get money to pay to release him. I had the money in my pocket. Like whenever I travel to these places, you can't use like a Visa card. So you carry around like, I went to Iraq the first time, I carried in like 70,000 bucks. I had like it in coffee grinds, you know, it's like a drug dealer. In this case, in Afghanistan, I had like 10 grand in my front pocket. I had 10,000. I started with 20 grand, and like halfway through, I had 10 grand. And I kept it in my pocket, in my jeans the whole time. There was no safe place to put it. My hotel didn't have a little safe with the beep, beep, beep. You can't trust anybody, so I just like kept this stuff on me. So I had the money, so I called up these editors in LA. I was working for the Los Angeles Times. I said, hey, what do we do? Like, we now know he's being held for ransom. The family thought he was dead. Now they're being like shaken down by these warlords who are like American allies, but the U.S. doesn't want to do anything. Should I pay his ransom? Like, let me just give the guys the money and get the kid out of here. And the editors are like, no, you need to have some professional distance. And I was like, that's fucking crazy. Like, I can't, accept that. But I had to. So then I did my best to write like a big bad story about this kid, and we ran a big picture of him, that little picture I had on the front page of the LA Times, and the instant that story hit, I started getting emails. Hundreds of people started writing me. Because it was all a story about this kid being held for ransom. Like, he was alive, his parents wanted him back, they were helpless, they were broke. I mean, these were dirt poor Pakistani farmers. He'd been totally sucked into this whole war, with the Taliban. He was a 16-year-old boy. And all these people in LA started writing to me, and they said, how can we help? So then I had to even get permission just to like write back to them. And I was like, okay, let me take somebody who's really motivated, and I'll ask him to be like the leader. And so then there's one guy that wrote me named Michael from Orange County. I was like, Michael, do you mind like coordinating this? And he's like, no problem. So then I just funneled all these emails to Michael, and I asked the people, I was like, do you mind if I give your email to this guy, Michael? They were like, most people said fine, but it's funny, in writing my book, I've like unearthed a lot of this stuff, and somebody actually wrote me like a really snarky email, like, that's a real cop-out, Jeffrey, like, you should be doing this. And I was like, dude, I just had this discussion, like, I'm trying. And so Michael then like started this, his name was Baharam, started this Baharam Liberation Fund, BLF, and he raised like 10,000 bucks in a week. And they wired it to Pakistan. It disappeared for a while. We thought like somebody had stolen it. This family was totally illiterate. They were like, this now is like pure Taliban. Like I saw the family in this area, and I could never go back there today. Like, it's off limits. It's 100 miles northwest of Islamabad. It's like badass Taliban territory now. And that's why the kid was involved. This area was just feeding people into the Taliban. But I went up there, I met with the family, and they had no resources. They didn't understand any, how to work money transfers. And so finally they got the money, and they wired it, and the kid came back. And I got an email like 2 months later saying he's out. And it was like one of the best things that's happened to me.
What a fantastic story.
I want to meet him. I haven't seen him since. I would love to give the guy a hug and just be like, I'm so happy he's out of there.
Well, it's beautiful the way, I know we have more questions, but I just have to say that your sense of caring about the individual people just shines through everything that you're saying, and I know it shines through your writing, but we have the great privilege of being in your presence and hearing this, and it's so encouraging, just speaking from the point of view of somebody who's involved with writing and those people in the audience who are students of writing, students of journalism, Dr. Christian, who teaches and is a wonderful writer herself. I mean, it's so gratifying to hear that degree of caring is still around, because it's so rare. I don't know if it doesn't get communicated in other people, or my thought is that you are just a very rare individual. Anyway, I think we have another question. Okay.
Habari yako leo?
Poa tu.
Asante sana kwa yote umefanya nchi
Asante
yangu.
sana. Asante.
Okay. I'm Kenyan, so I can speak Swahili. And all I was saying is hi and thank you for all you're doing in my country. I'm actually live in Evanston, so I'm very excited to be here. And my dad's a journalist in Kenya, writing a book, so maybe I can talk to you after this. But, my question to you is your experience of Americans over the years, because I've been here quite a number of years, and when I first came to the US, it was amazing how shocked that people were that I could speak English and that I wore clothes and all of that. So do you feel that, over the years with social media, with internet and all of that, Americans have become more educated and, we're kind of going to a better place with what we think Africa or Kenya or whatever is? Thank you so much.
Ni swali nzuri sana. I think it's a really good question. I don't know. Here's an example. I came back in October to visit my family, and my sister lives in Evanston, and some friends were having a get-together at her house, and somebody said to her, my sister, and they were totally serious, I'm not sure Jeffrey should come because he's in Kenya and maybe there's an Ebola problem. This is before I went to, this is way before I went to Sierra Leone. So yeah, exactly. It's London's closer to the Ebola hot zone than Kenya. So I don't know. I think there's been some big Africa stories, like the Boko Haram stuff, and the Ebola. It's definitely, Africa, unfortunately, produces these big, bad stories that, of hardship and suffering, just over the last, there's never been a period where there's not been some big, bad African story, whether it's the Ethiopian famine or Somalia or Rwanda, you know what I mean? That's what happens. So, I don't know. I think what's interesting about Kenya, Kenya is one of the bright, it's one of the most, promising countries in Africa, no doubt. And I hope that as commercial interests and as economic opportunity and opportunities for Americans increases, we'll start to care more. GE just opened a big office, in Nairobi, Domino's Pizza. That's kind of a bummer for me, so you don't move to Kenya to eat Domino's Pizza. But for Kenyans, like, and for people there, it's like, this is cool. Like, we get to experience like middle class life like anybody else in the world. So I think maybe as Africa develops, like a lot's happening right now in Kenya, and even in Ethiopia and a lot of places, but like Kenya's one of the more interesting ones. I think there will be some more crossover. But it's like I was on the plane today from Syracuse, New York, and I was showing this woman some pictures, and like most people just don't have the first real thought about Africa. I was like, what do you think of when I tell you like I live in Nairobi? She's like, I think of giraffes. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I mean, they're giraffes. You know, you can go to places in Lingata or wherever that aren't that far from downtown Nairobi, and there are some giraffes. But you know, that's what makes it interesting as a journalist, because it's like you're constantly trying to decipher a part of the world that most people just don't have any experience with. And everybody that comes and visits us, like they get like why we live there. They're like, this is beautiful. This is a wonderful part of the world to live in. Like I get it, like why you're there and why you're not in a rush to come home. But it's still just, you know, it's still part of the world that's kind of separate. Like for instance, we had to get an internet system installed in our office when I first started. When I first started in 2006, the internet was so bad in Nairobi. It was a dial-up connection, really dial-up, like, you know, what they were using 10 years ago. I mean, before that in the States. I mean, the slowest connection. So we sent out a guy from the New York Times whose job it is to like set up offices around the world. And East Africa was we have bureaus in 30 different places. East Africa was the last office to get high-speed internet in the whole world. Like West Africa had it before because it was closer to Europe. The Middle East had it. South America, everybody had it except us. So that just kind of symbolized like how cut off it still is. The Brits have like a colonial history. So the average guy in the street in London or the young person like maybe has backpacked in Kenya, they know more. But Americans, they don't. So I think it's better, you know. I mean, I'm sorry, like you meet like that ignorance face to face, and I'm not surprised. But I don't know. I think it'll get better. Like they're trying to do a direct flight. So right now to get from Nairobi to Chicago or New York, you have to take like 2 8-hour flights. There's no direct connection. The U.S. is like paranoid about terrorism. They're not allowing any of these flights to come in from. That's what it is. It's not a logistical thing. These airlines want to do it, but right now there's no direct flight. I think if you have stuff like that, that'll change. But it'll be slow. I mean, Africa is just, that's what's really interesting about it. But it's different from the rest of the world.
You mentioned that you visited East Africa after your freshman year of college at Cornell, and that you made a particularly poignant comment, which was that you were struck by the humanity of the individuals you met, by how expressive they were and how generous they were, especially given the fact that they didn't have much to give. I was wondering if you could tell us more, because I wanted to hear more.
You got to read the book. No, that's a really good question. I mean, that was the number one thing that struck me was these people are so poor and have so little and are so, you know, you hit the nail on the head, are so generous, are so open, are so warm, are so like just emotionally available, and the sense of community is so strong, and the values are so good, and they still are. Like that's what I like about living in Kenya. I mean, there's like really wealthy Kenyans now, but they're not like blowing money on, you know, bling cars or, you know, just really sort of ostentatious things. Like people invest in education and their families. Like it's still like those old school values are still very prominent. And I saw that from my first trip. The trip I took was, I went with a bunch of students. We drove from Nairobi to the border of Mozambique and Malawi, and there was a really bad civil war in Mozambique that was a superpower civil war. The U.S. was backing a conservative right-wing regime against like a upsurging, communist rebel group or government in Mozambique, and it was a really nasty war in the 80s. And in 1990, when I went, there was still lots of refugees living in Malawi, which is just north of Mozambique or east of Mozambique, or west of Mozambique. I don't cover these countries, but next to Mozambique. And so it was just a totally eye-opening experience. And it was a really interesting time because there was no email, there was no cell phones. Like I was immersed. Like when you land in these places, there's nothing that yanks you out. There's no escape hatch. And that's what you have today in the world. Like you either have your email that you can check and instantly be in touch with everybody from home, or your cell phone and walk down the street and be walking down the street in Nairobi talking to somebody in Chicago, like I do it all the time. But that kind of takes you out of the spirit of the place. And when we were there in 1990, there was none of that. I would call home every couple weeks to let my parents know I was alive. And it was an ordeal. We had to go to the post office, wait in line, give money, It was like, a pain in the butt. And so it was just a great time to be a young person on the road. And there wasn't like this bigger narrative of terrorism in, the West versus Islam and how we're all kind of like have bullseyes on us the way we sort of do now, or feel we do. So that was just a wonderful summer. And, I tell people, like I was 18, you're really green, and maybe if I had gone to Bolivia, I'd be like talking to you right now about South America, or maybe if I'd gone to China. Like I was just a blank canvas, but at a great age, because I was mature enough that I was interested and curious about the world. I wasn't like, oh, why do I care? I just am caught up in my high school stuff. I was just at that right age, but I hadn't seen much at all. And that part of Africa it's a beautiful part of Africa. I mean, it still is. So yeah, I learned a ton that summer, and it was like I took a left turn in life. Like I went to Cornell, I thought I was going to be a history major. I thought I was going to be a lawyer like my dad. Like that was what I thought, and I didn't think much more about it. And all of a sudden, I just took a left turn, and I was like, wait a second, like I want to be part of this place. And that's, why we're all sitting here right now.
I'm the lawyer and the dad.
Yeah, a lot to ask.
We got to give you, and Mom is
and
here as
Mom
well.
is here.
Raise your hand, Mom. You got to get some credit.
She needs the credit, yeah. And I know my son is very jet lagged at the moment, but there's a lot of undergraduates here, young people, and I'd like to know what advice you might give to them at this stage in their lives based on the path that you've taken in your life.
Do your homework.
Say it would be easy.
I don't know. I would just say, like, stick to your passion. I think there's like a lot of pressure as you're a young person to stick to do the conventional things. And you guys, there was many questions of, oh, you thinking of law school still? And even when I was in Florida, like, what about law school? So I think there's a lot of pressure, even from ostensibly well-meaning people, that you just want to do what's safe. Like journalism can be a struggle. I lived in a little town. I didn't make much money. I was 1,000 miles away from my nearest friend. I was with my wife. We were together. She was my girlfriend at the time. We were together, but going out, but we weren't together. She was in Washington. She was in New York. I was like following these jobs in these crazy places all around the United States to climb up the ladder of journalism, and it was hard. And so I think there's a lot of pressure and I've seen people that are really talented, really smart, even more charming than me, believe it or not. Just drop off the journalism path and just say, you know what, I'm gonna work for an investment bank. I'm gonna go into management consultancy. I'm gonna teach. I'm gonna do something else because it's tough. And there aren't that many jobs. And even now, today, there's like a kind of challenged industry. I won't call it a dying industry, but I think it's in a turbulence. But my general advice would be just like you're going to enjoy life and do well at what you really want to do, and try that first. Like that was my thing. Like I wasn't sure the journalism was going to work out. I even had an offer to work on Wall Street that I didn't turn down when I took this first job in this little town in Florida. I deferred it, and they were nice enough. They're like, okay, let's talk in a year, because I wasn't sure it was going to all work out. So I would say like the path of least regret. Like that's the term I use. Like take the path of least regret, and that's like do something you really want to do, you believe in, and if that doesn't work out, then you can try something else. But as an undergraduate, you should just be doing what you're interested in. You should be taking the classes that move you. You should be gravitating to the subjects that you just are passionate about, not so much what's going to lead to a job. Because you don't know what's going to lead to a job. You know, that's number one. I mean, unless you're very specifically focused on like medicine or engineering or something like that. And there are people that are good at that and really want to do that, and that's great. But if you're not, like a lot of us, and you just have a bunch of different interests, you don't know what's going to lead to a job. So don't like get too wrapped up about that. And in college, you have a huge opportunity to like develop yourself intellectually and really just try to learn as much as you can, however cliche that sounds. But that's going to be it. Like the minute you walk out of college, like you're never going to have that opportunity again. And my wife and I always talk about like, oh, if we could go back to college, what would we take and what do we wish we had studied? And it's pretty different, you know, from what we did study. I mean, for me, I did a pretty good job of like following this advice I'm giving now while I was in college. But, you know, I was still a little confused. I thought I should take bio for pre-med because maybe I want to be a doctor. And, you know, maybe I would have been an okay doctor, but that like wasn't really what moved me. So that's my general advice. It's just like follow your heart and go for it, and then you can scale back the ambition if it doesn't work out.
And just to follow up for just a moment, and then we'll get right back to you. In terms of those folks in the audience right now who are focusing on writing, can you think of anything that was particularly helpful that you did or you learned or you were mentored by somebody who taught you something related specifically to writing?
That's a really good question. I think reading like is the number one thing. Like read good stuff. Not like, you know, I mean, like John Grisham. Like, I mean, you can read for enjoyment and entertainment, but read really well-written stuff. Because that's how you will learn how to write well. And just like, don't waste we all are busy, right? Everybody's busy, you know? And don't waste your time reading some stuff you're not going to learn from. Because you read, like I'm on this Conrad kick, Joseph Conrad. You read a lot of these great books when you're really young. And you get like 20% of their value, you know? I remember reading Heart of Darkness, and I kind of got it. And I was like, oh, this is cool. It's about Congo and colonialism and, you know, what's really the heart of darkness? Is it in Africa or is it within the man? But now it's like I'm rereading all this Conrad stuff, and like the use of language is so amazing. And there's like, you know, Faulkner, Hemingway, whoever, you know.
And Conrad was somebody for whom English was his second language, which makes it even more amazing.
But maybe that's why he was more precise. Like maybe that worked to his advantage because he didn't take anything for granted. So I think that's the number one rule is like read good, well-written stuff. And then number two is like writing, you just have to loosen up when you write. Like that's people's number one problem when they try to write well. They're just tight. They're trying to write to how they think they should write. And they're trying to follow rules. And like you have to follow rules, obviously, with punctuation and style, and there's conventions. And a lot of the work I do is very formulaic. Like I'll be the first one to admit that. Like newspaper writing can be very formulaic. You come up with like a pretty picture in the first couple sentences, and you have a quote, a voice, and then you have what we call the nut graph, like the meaning of the story. You know, the famine is taking a bad turn in Somalia, and the militant groups are blocking food aid, and then you go back into the details and maybe some background. This problem started 20 years ago, and here's why, and then you bring it back to the present tense. That's all pretty formulaic, and it's a drawback. Like it's, you know, it's not good to get like just be sort of doing it by rote. But within that, there's ways to operate. But generally speaking, with writing, you just have to open up. And like the number one rule I tell people is write how you speak. Like write how you speak. Like read what you just written, and would you say that? And if you wouldn't say that, don't write that. Because that's like, it's just stiffer. Like if you can write how you speak, it will be pretty good. Because people are effective communicators when they speak. I mean, we all use grammar and make mistakes, but just in general, the words you use, the rhythms you use, if you can capture that in writing, it'll be pretty good.
Good. It's a good reason also to take things like screenwriting and playwriting, and then you really get in touch with that. We had a question over here. Wait.
On your,
Am I
on
looking?
your
Oh,
left
oh,
first.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
My question is about the Chinese in Africa. And you can answer this from whichever direction you want, but hopefully more human side. What do you see from the Chinese actually operating there? So aside from the policy, et cetera, are they behaving at all like the British anthropologists, or get a job done, move on?
No,
et
it's a really
cetera?
interesting. Can I ask you a question?
You may, but I have a follow-up question just so I don't forget. If you can also give everybody a recommendation for your favorite book about Africa,
Okay,
besides yours or her father's, at the end of it would be great. But yeah.
Okay, no,
follow-up
let me
question.
do that first. So there's like a number of great books on Africa. The best one recently, I think, is a book called What is the What? By Dave Edgars about South Sudan. It's just amazing, well written, just crazy, just emotional story. That's a really good one. Bend in the River is a book about Congo, which is like a classic. There's a really good memoir called My Traitor's Heart, which is a really well-written book, really interesting, about a white guy in South Africa in the 80s who's like a liberal and can't stand apartheid, and his family was like the worst, they were like the architects of apartheid going back like 5 generations to the 1800s. My Traitor's Heart, it's a really good book. Those are a few. Now about the Chinese thing, I'm just curious like why you asked that. Like what have you read or heard that makes you think of that interest in that?
I'll keep it short. But we have some history in Kenya. In March of 2009, landed at the airport, flew, did stuff for a month. I left. I came back in July. There's an arch over the road from the airport back. China and Kenya shaking hands. I'm back by September or November, and suddenly there's 10 times more Chinese engineers on the streets helping build roads. And then in my job, I see a lot of what's going on as well. So
That sounds very suspicious.
that evolution, which has certainly accelerated since 2009,
Right.
is what's interesting to me. And that's why I say I'm sort of less, personally, I'm sort of less interested in the policy side of the Chinese as the new colonizers, but just, in Congo, or in Angola, at one point there was 1 million Chinese living there. And so just as Chinese, how you see them as the new version of British colonizers or whatever.
So the big picture is China needs resources for their economy. Like it's all based on manufacturing. Economic growth in China is like based on the fact that they get raw materials and they make tons of stuff, and we all buy it all over the world now. So they need raw materials. They need to make sure they have enough copper, they have enough steel, they have enough gold, they have enough oil, everything. And that's their whole economic growth and the stability of China's politics is all premised on keeping that engine going. And they don't have that many natural resources in China, and Africa's a place that has tons of natural resources. Congo, it's estimated to have like, I don't know, what was it, $20 trillion of resource. I mean, it has gold, it has diamonds, it has coltan, it has all this stuff. So that's the bigger picture, is that they want resources. But they're not idiots, they're taking like a long-term approach to this. So it's not just like, let's grab all the copper right now. Let's make friends with the African governments, help them in the ways that they need, and then we'll get the inside track on these resources. So in Kenya, for instance, they were doing like all this secret stuff, like giving the Kenyan government weapons to back a militia, secret militia that was going to go into Somalia. It was a Chinese government project. That's something the U.S. wouldn't do, or not in a big way like that. Like maybe the CIA or others would help the Kenyans a little bit, but they wouldn't like arm them and buy uniforms for them and thousands of stuff. They wouldn't do that. The Chinese were also helping set up a surveillance system in Kenya for the national government wanted to set up like an NSA type cell phone tapping thing, and the Chinese were like on the ground floor of that. So it's just like a strategic interest for China to work with these African governments to get the resources. On the ground, the Chinese are very insulated. Like you see their construction sites. They have a big banner in Chinese that nobody else can read except the 50 dudes that are working there. Like Kenyans can't read it. I can't read it. It's all in Chinese, and it says what their company is. And they stay on their sites, and they don't mix a lot. That's different than like the Europeans that were like out there and, you know, buying land and trying to settle, and were really interested in kind of like settling in Africa, to live in Africa, not just for business. For China, it's like almost purely for business. But, you know, it's changing. Like where I live in a sort of, you know, nice neighborhood of Nairobi with big houses and nice trees, and there's a big mall there. And the Chinese people I used to see when I first moved in 2006, the only Chinese I would see were guys on the road, like construction. They're not the grunts on the construction sites. They're like the supervisors. So you don't see them like with a hammer, but you might see them driving a bulldozer, or they're standing on the road telling the bulldozer driver where to go. Used to be the only Chinese I would see. Now I see them like hanging out at the mall with families, taking pictures in like the more affluent parts of Nairobi. So there's definitely like the mobility within Kenya of the Chinese. Most Kenyans, like, you know, people are a little suspicious, and there's not like a lot of interaction. In Zambia, they had this horrible thing where some Chinese mine bosses like shot at these Zambian workers who were protesting about their pay, and they killed some guys or wounded some guys. So that was like, that didn't, you know, that left that made a really bad impression of the Chinese in Zambia. But I don't know, you just, everybody's interested in like economic growth. That's all anybody's like talking about, interested in. So the Chinese, if they're part of that, they're not really seen as a problem.
I'm going to stop you there because I know we had one question. No, you're okay? All right, I have a final question.
Okay.
You have a wife, and you've got 2 small children. And I'm wondering if you have any comment. You've done a lot of amazing and often dangerous things. And I'm wondering what the wife of the foreign correspondent Pulitzer Prize winner, I wonder how she has adapted to this, or how just what does she do in her own right? Just something from her point of view.
Well, she'd probably kick my butt for speaking for her.
Well,
No, it's too bad we can't like Skype.
We're not hooked in, so.
So my wife and I have known each other forever. We met when we were in college. I was 19, she was 18 or 17. It took us a long time to get married. She dumped me twice. I held on. She's a lawyer, and she was a public defender, a criminal defense attorney, public defender in Newark, New Jersey, before we moved, which is like a really tough, like inner city she represented juveniles. It just really like, you know, kids that had gotten in trouble and had some really hard cases. Then we moved to Kenya, and I kind of like yanked her out of like what she was really into doing, and that was hard. But since then, she's found a good job working for the State Department, running a program that's connected to law enforcement. So she's doing well. It's hard. I mean, if I'm doing my job really well, I'm traveling all the time. Because there's stuff going on throughout, did my mic just die? There's stuff going on throughout Africa, like all the time, even in my patch of Africa. So if I'm really doing my job, like I'm on the road all the time. And that sucks for like a marriage, for being a father, for the family. My kids, you know, they're heartbroken when I leave, and I'm really sad. And so now I have to like, it's just a balance. It's a real balancing act. Do I go off and do a story that I know could like help a lot of people, or do I like totally ruin like my kid's week? And that's like,
tough.
It is. But she gets it, and when we first moved there, we traveled together a bit, and so she understands the region, which is great. So if I'm in Bukavu, Congo, or Mogadishu, Somalia, or you know, Juba, South Sudan, like she's been to these places, and that's nice. So she can picture like when I'm calling her
She
up.
can connect with
yeah,
that.
she has like a picture in her mind of what I'm doing, and she might even know some of the same people I'm working with. So,
And are you planning to remain? I mean, is your plan to pretty much remain doing what you're doing, and
I really
or
like
are you
what I'm
thinking
doing. I guess
of?
you guys can tell. I really like what I'm doing. So I'd like to do it. There may come like a reckoning where the New York Times is like, hey, it's time for you to move. Do you want to work in China? Do you want to go somewhere else? And that's going to be tough because
you love.
I got into this business
Here.
to be like in Africa. Like I didn't want to be a journalist anywhere. I wanted to live in Africa way before I wanted to be a journalist. So Africa kind of comes first for me.
Well, we're very fortunate that you feel that way, and we know that from now on, and I'm sure people who maybe have been reading you once in a while are going to be followers of your stories in the New York Times. And we're very fortunate to have you, and we were very fortunate to have you with us tonight. Thank you so very much.
Thanks everybody for coming and listening.
So we know that there's been a lot of traveling in the last couple of days. Thank you all for coming and your wonderful questions.